The agenda this week took the measure of liberal democracy, from the state of the mainstream media to the challenges of populism, diversity, and multiculturalism. First up, though, the week in review begins with a look at the province of Ontario's debt burden. Craig, get us started here. How concerned are you at the size of the Ontario debt?
Well, Ontario has the fiscal capacity to meet its debt obligations, but the amount of debt that it's taken on is actually creating quite a big burden. And at the same time, it's posing some significant risks for the future. When you look at debt service costs, because interest rates are so low, only 9 cents of every dollar of tax revenue is going to service the debt, which is manageable. But the problem is that when you do it in dollar terms, that's $12 billion that could be going to other social priorities like health and education. So even though there isn't a fiscal crisis in Ontario, the point is that there's a large cost associated with the enormous debt that Ontario has taken on.
So on a scale of 0 to 10, 0 means you don't care about it at all, 10 means the apocalypse is coming. Where do I put you?
I'd be a 7 or an 8.
You'd be a 7 or an 8.
Because at the end of the day, when you do forward-looking projections, the amount of pressure that's going to come on the healthcare system basically is going to lead to healthcare expenditures far outstripping the province's fiscal capacity to meet them. And as a result, while we don't have a crisis today, when you look forward, economics says that Ontario is on an unsustainable path, so we need to do something about it.
Lisa Phillips, when you look at that $350 billion plus debt number, what do you think?
You know, it's not keeping me awake at night. I think that all of us who have mortgages could easily freak ourselves out by looking at the dollar amount that we owe. But the reality is that this is paid over a long period of time. We have a plan to pay it down. Hopefully we have rising income. If we can sustain a balanced budget for a period of time, there will be a natural kind of decline in the relationship between the debt and the GDP.
So again, on that scale of 0 to 10?
I'm more of a 3 or a 4.
You're a 3 or a 4. Okay. Kaylee, I'm coming to you next. You look at that number and what do you think?
I feel the same. I'm more of a 3 or a 4. I think that certainly if you just put that number up without any context behind it, it can have some shock value. But in fact, if you look at the larger context, and Craig laid some of that out already, there is not so much to worry about. And in fact, what we should be thinking about is how we're going to raise the revenue to pay for the other things that we're going to need to pay for, including additional healthcare costs and those sorts of things going into the future.
Okay, Bill, your view.
I'll put myself near Craig's end of the spectrum. A couple of points. I actually am more concerned because the apocalypse isn't coming, which sounds like a funny thing to say, but who's in more trouble? The person who's digging a hole, whose credit card isn't maxed out and is piling on debt for consumption, or the person who's already kind of run into the wall and is forced to square revenue and expenditure? In a way, Ontario's deep fiscal capacity is a problem because we don't have that external check on what we're doing. We've had some decline in our credit ratings, but nobody's seriously saying the province is running out of room to borrow. And that means that we've got the shovel in our hands and we're able to dig faster than we would otherwise. So one quick nuance on that. With regard to the numbers, the thing that I would say is that the debt figures that we've been talking about are the ones that also include debt that finance infrastructure spending. So some of this stuff, there are actually assets, and that type of debt worries me a bit less. I mean, we can talk about whether every infrastructure investment is wise and whether the government has the right way of approaching that. But in general, I think a lot of us would say, and here's the mortgage analogy, you got a house to live in, so you've got an asset. A lot of what's in that debt number, though, is just the accumulated deficits. And that's the money that we were basically consuming but didn't feel like we could raise the taxes to cover at the time.
So if I'm putting a number on your level of concern, what is it?
Yeah, so I would be in the, I'll give myself an 8. With the anxiety being a little higher that we still are in a position to keep adding to this debt. And I totally agree with what Craig said about the healthcare costs. That's massive. And just to spice up the concern a little bit, I'll also add some pension obligations that we can't see, but they're out there. And also the municipal requirements that are out there. I mean, when we think about other things we're going to want some tax room for, municipalities have fairly big loads to carry in the future as well, and the province needs to make room for that.
You use the house analogy, and Lisa, let me pick up on that with you. Everybody understands, and you used it as well, the notion of you got to go into debt to buy a house. Mm-hmm. Almost nobody's paying cash to buy their house these days. You got to borrow money to buy for the house. But if you're borrowing or putting the electricity bills on a credit card, that's a different thing. Everybody seems to agree that is not a great idea. That suggests that you're overextended. Can you tell how much of that $350 billion of debt is actually for the house and how much is for the electricity?
We know some of it's for the electricity, but here's where I'd like to just draw attention to the fact that this discussion so often focuses on the spending side, on the expenses. And we know there's also a revenue side of the budget. And if we need to bring current expenditures like the electricity and revenues into balance, I think that erosion of the revenue base in Ontario has been a major cause of why we've had this long stretch of deficits.
Erosion of revenue base means taxes are not high enough in your view. Is that right?
Yes, it means that we've had a 15-year campaign of tax cuts at the federal level, and that those tax policy choices have directly impacted Ontario's revenues. It's very hard to separate the two levels of government on the revenue side. And so, when the federal government cuts taxes for 15 years, GST, personal income tax, corporate tax, lots of new expensive tax expenditures, it reduces their ability to make transfer payments to Ontario to help Ontario balance its budget. Ontario has also made some tax cuts. I think there's less room to maneuver there, but I think we've got to talk to our federal partners about a better partnership.
The same motto that is the title of this film. All governments lie. And that's what all journalists have to remember. If journalism is the first draft of history, it can't just be State Department or White House press releases. And so often it is media journalists as stenographers to power. And so it's our job to go out every day and go to where the silence is. Go to what isn't scripted, to see what's happening with our own eyes. And that is something that the corporate media has failed miserably on, especially when it comes to war. Because when the media repeats the lies of governments, whatever their party, the lies take lives. And we see that over and over again, as Jeff just pointed out and is really well illustrated in the film, the lead up to the invasion of Iraq.
Well, Dick Cheney was quoting the New York Times, which was reporting leaks from Dick Cheney.
That's right.
on where to go.
And you had Colin Powell, February 5th, 2003, giving this major address at the United Nations that he has later called a blot on his career. Where, I mean, he had great credibility. He was a general, the Secretary of State, because he had been dragging his feet on the war. So for him to give that speech that was the final nail in the coffin for so many, making the case for war. So that's the government. But the four major nightly newscasts, I mean, Jeff can talk about the study FAIR did. 2 weeks around that period, there were something like 393 interviews done around war when half the population was opposed, half for. In fact, 393 interviews, only 3 were with anti-war leaders. That's no longer a mainstream media. That's an extreme media beating the drums for war.
I appreciate that all governments lie. I think we all know that. The question is, do all governments lie all the time? What do you think of that?
No, I don't think that they lie all the time.
So we do have to understand that there is some truth that comes out, and we need to be able to distinguish what's truth from fiction.
Right. We have to be independent. We cannot be a party to the parties. We have to be there as the fourth estate, not for the state.
Fred,
and we need journalists to really to keep them accountable.
Well, you've actually led me where I want to go next, because some of the journalists that you chronicle in your film, some of them have been on this program. Matt Taibbi has been on this program. You have Glenn Greenwald, Jeremy Scahill at The Intercept, David Corn, Brother Jones. Why focus on them?
Well, we wanted to look at, we asked ourselves really, who are the I.F. Stones, the Izzy Stones of today? And one good gauge of that is there is an award given out called the Izzy Award. It's given out by Ithaca College under the direction of Jeff Cohen. And we started by looking at, and it's given to journalists who are carrying on the tradition, following in the footsteps of I.F. Stone. Amy, of course, has won it. Jeremy Scahill has won it.
Glenn Greenwald, David Corn, Naomi Klein.
Yeah, who we tried to get, but she was ridiculously busy.
John Carlos Frey, who's done all this reporting on the U.S.-Mexico border. He won the award one year.
Have there been any journalists from the main American television networks or CNN or MSNBC, any of those journalists that you think are in this category?
Very few. The problem is, I mean, the beauty of I.F. Stone and the beauty of Amy Goodman and the new generation of I.F. Stones is that they just have this sense of independence from the powers that be. And, you know, they know that you have to sometimes stick it to the man, or, question authority, don't believe the establishment. If you work for the mainstream media in the U.S. today, you're working for the man. It's very hard to navigate that. I worked in cable news for a number of years. But so who are the I.F. Stones that work on the inside? They're usually people that are almost on their way out. I mean, one of the great investigative writers in the country today in the U.S. is James Risen at the New York Times, and he has to sometimes publish his best work in books because they somehow couldn't make it into the New York Times.
They wouldn't publish some of his stuff.
Right.
That's right.
And Chris Hedges, who's in our documentary.
Chris, yes, who's been on this program too.
An accomplished reporter for the New York Times.
Yeah.
But
In
really,
fact, it was, Edward Snowden decided not to go to the Times precisely because of how they had suppressed Risen's information. He thought, I can't trust they're actually going to follow through on this. I have to go to people who are serious. And so other people featured in the film, Laura Poitras and Glenn Greenwald.
Is this an American phenomenon, what you're describing here? Journalists being in the tank too much for the people they cover?
No, but
It's
I
everywhere?
think that American journalism is extremely powerful in shaping the narrative all over the world. I mean, because the U.S. invades Iraq, it's not just about the U.S., so it really matters. I think you have this problem everywhere. People, journalists being stenographers to their own powers that be, and we all have to be independent.
But if you're an anchor for a big American television program and you get invited, let's say, to the White House for one of those dinners, do you really think you can be bought for that?
No one is saying that because you had dinner at the White House, I mean, you could be finding out a lot of things there, that you're compromised. The question is what you do on your broadcast, what your journalism is all about. And all too often, the networks fail us. Look at the 2016 presidential election. I can't single out CNN or Fox or MSNBC in the United States. Donald Trump sounds the same on all three networks. It's all Trump TV.
We in Canada love to think that we're a great model for the rest of the world when it comes to this issue that we're talking about tonight. Do you think that we have something to teach the world based on our experience of the last 45 years with this policy?
I think you do. In Mexico, I always speak of Canada as something to aspire to, not of the U.S. in terms of its capitalism, its social safety nets, its welfare state, its pluralism, its diversity. I confess, I'll say it publicly, I have a big crush on Justin Trudeau for several reasons. It's not because he's handsome, although he is. It's because when he was asked why he had so many women in his cabinet, he said, well, it's 2015. And because he welcomed Syrian refugees, and because Canada has been a force for good, I think, in the world in terms of peacekeeping, in terms of humanitarian intervention, in terms of a foreign policy that is quite sophisticated and quite independent vis-a-vis the U.S. in a way that many countries in the world have not been. And I think those are important lessons to teach.
Here's the key question going forward, though, and I guess I'll put this to you first, and we're going to look at some tape first, because as much as you love Justin Trudeau, when he did meet the mayor of London, your hometown right now, who happens to be a Muslim, the first ever in London's history, they had a meeting, and some people actually weren't thrilled with what the Prime Minister of Canada had to say. But let's hear it firsthand, and then we'll have a discussion about it. Go ahead, please, Sheldon.
In my district in Saint Michel, there are Italian grandmothers who still pretty much only speak Italian, don't speak much French or English, but their kids and their grandkids are seamlessly and completely integrated into Montreal, and the only difference is that they tend to be trilingual and not just bilingual. And that's, this is understanding that when we think about integration and success, we can't be overly impatient. We need to be respectful and keep a solid pressure and forward movement.
The shared values that Canada is famous for is so important, and it's really important that the left recognises we've got to address this issue. The time of laissez-faire integration is going to happen by itself. Just chillax. Those days are gone.
That felt like a point of departure between Mayor Khan and Prime Minister Trudeau, where the PM says, you know, we got to take our time on this and not force this, and Mayor Khan saying, the days of chillaxing are over, we got to go for this right now. What do you think?
I have to agree with Sadiq Khan on this, and I have a lot of reservations about Prime Minister Trudeau, and I have a lot of reservations about the mythology of multiculturalism in this country. That having been said, I think there is something about, and I'll come back to it, about a political project. And I think what we're seeing in cities like London is the need, a growing need and a growing acceptance by people who would see themselves as progressive or on the political left, and who see inclusive societies and progressive political societies as a value to be aspired to. We also see the importance of a political project which has a roadmap for inclusion, but that is predicated on an engaged citizenship, a citizenry that is active and involved. One of the interesting things going on, I don't know if you've been following, maybe some of your viewers have, is the Labour Party's political race in the United Kingdom. We have a very left-wing, solidly socialist leader of the Labour Party defending his position, running for the party again. Who are his supporters? Who are the people, this momentum movement that they talk about?
It's Jeremy Corbyn.
It's Jeremy Corbyn. Corbyn supporters are urban, they're diverse, they're children of Bangladeshis and Pakistanis and Somalis and Nigerians. They're children of people from the white working class.
The Bernie Sanders types.
Yeah, who really understand what it means to mobilize and who understand the importance of a political project which puts certain political values at the helm. I agree that sometimes, you know, the prosaic interaction between people is important. But ultimately, I think the future I dream of for my son, who's 5.5 years old, is that he'll grow up to be a global soul, to use Pico's term from that's so relevant today. But at the same time, someone who will be committed to a political project, who sees that progressive, inclusive politics and the amelioration of economic and social injustice and the full inclusion of people from a whole range of minorities and ethnicities and identities find a space in the public square. That's just not going to happen. And I think one of the problems with Canadian multiculturalism is that we've felt like we'll let the policy take care of it. Multiculturalism takes care of itself. We have an official department, we have some nice programs, but what about political power? Can multiculturalism at times be disempowering? Does multiculturalism in Canada paper over the cracks?
How was history used, for example, in the Brexit debate over whether or not to stay or to leave the EU?
Well, it was used often very badly and often incorrectly, particularly by the Leave campaign, who painted a picture of a glorious independent Britain in the past. They talked about the British Empire, they talked about the spirit of Dunkirk, they talked about the glorious isolation of Britain in the past. And I think it was wrongly used because it portrayed a Britain that never existed. Britain was always and has always been involved in the continent, and British kings often had continental relatives. The British royal family was essentially German, and still is in many ways. And so I think it was wrongly used, and I think the Remain campaign never really managed to counter that very nostalgic narrative.
So this is one of those things where don't let the facts get in the way of a good story.
Exactly. And you know, when you appeal to nostalgia, you know, you get at people's emotions and not at their rational side.
Having said that, you're a historian. Don't you love it when history is brought to bear in a campaign?
Well, I like history being used, of course, but it annoys me when history is used, as I see it, incorrectly, when claims are made in the name of history which simply are unfounded. And there was a lot of that in the Brexit campaign.
Did historians come forward and say, you guys are on thin ice with all this stuff? That's not how it happened at all.
You know, historians did come forward. I'm not sure anyone listened to us, but something like 300, in my view, very good British historians signed a letter saying, look, we think that Britain has always been part of Europe. We dislike this whole misuse of history. There was a much smaller group of historians, mainly historians of Britain itself, who were for leave. But I would say, you know, pound for pound or quality for quality, the Remain historians were an awful lot better than the Leave historians.
I think I know how you're going to answer this question, but we seem to be living in a time, and I don't know how much historical precedent there is for this, when facts don't matter, but how you feel about stuff does.
Well, I think that is absolutely right. I mean, in fact, you have people like Michael Gove, who was one of the leading Brexit campaigners, Tory, in the UK, saying we don't need to listen to experts. You know, why should we listen to experts? And I think you see that in a lot of the appeal that Donald Trump has. I mean, he doesn't listen to experts. He doesn't think it's necessary to listen to experts. He makes up his own mind. And so I do think we're living in a time when people say, I don't really know much about the facts, but I feel. And so you had a lot of people in England saying, I just feel that Britain would be better off out of the European Union, without really knowing whether or not it would be, without having really looked at the arguments. And I think that's happened before. I mean, I think in a way the appeal of the extremes in the 1930s, whether they were on the left or on the right, whether they were communists or varieties of fascists, were on that emotional basis. You know, Germany will be great again, Italy will have another Roman Empire. I mean, that matters, and people do often respond. We're not rational beings, we like to think we are.
Well, if we're in a time, and we have been before, as you suggest, where facts are less important maybe than ever, and feelings are more important than ever, if you're running a campaign, how are you supposed to deal with that?
I don't know. I think it's a real problem. I think it's a real problem for journalists such as you. How do you deal with often inflated claims that are being made? I mean, Donald Trump, for example. I mean, I'm sorry to keep on going on about Donald Trump, but he's much in the news.
Topical.
Topical. It says, you know, Mexicans are rapists and thieves and murderers. I mean, how do you deal with that? You point to the statistics which show that, in fact, Mexicans commit fewer murders per head than American natural citizens commit per head. But it somehow doesn't get through. I guess you just keep hammering at it, and you have to hope that in the schools we educate the younger generation to be skeptical about what they're being told, to ask questions, to probe, to say, wait a minute, those figures, let me know the basis for that. I don't think we're doing that nearly enough.
Let me come back to Brexit for a second. It was the subject of some discussion on this program not too long ago, and Michael Corrin, who I guess originally is from over there and is now over here, had this to say about that. Roll tape, please.
A lot of the other towns, irrespective of the ethnicity of the people, by the way, it's illusory to think that it was only white working class people. A lot of people who are brown and black said, we don't want to be told what to think and how to feel any longer. To a degree, yes, globalization has passed us by, but that's not the only issue here. There was something visceral and something emotional. They simply believed that the country they had grown up with was changing radically. And here's an important point to make, because I've heard a lot of people say, well, it was racism. In a way, it may have been, but it wasn't racism against people from the former British Empire or Commonwealth. It was people from Poland and Romania, good, fine people, but were coming into Britain and transforming the nature and the employment force of the country.
How much of that analysis do you want to sign on to?
No, I think he's absolutely right. What is curious about it is it was the areas which had the fewest immigrants from places like Poland who were the most anti-immigrant. And so I think the immigrant from Poland or the immigrant from Romania or the fear of 3 million immigrants from Turkey, which was totally unfounded, but nevertheless people began to believe, it was the fear and the perception rather than the actuality. And I think immigrants got blamed for a lot of things that people didn't like about their lives. It was partly a way, I think, of expressing an anti-elite feeling. We're fed up with these elites, whether in Brussels or London, telling us what to do, and we're going to show them what we think.
This is not just a refugee crisis because of the numbers, but it's a refugee crisis because of where these people are from. Yes. The Muslim integration of Europe is not a completely happy story. And I wonder how you, again, small L liberals, compete with what is already a narrative that seems baked in.
Yeah. Baked in the sense, if you're in Hungary, where I'm currently living, you know, Hungary for 400 years defined itself as the southern frontier of Christianity against Islam. It's very hard to change that. Budapest was occupied by the Turks. We have these beautiful Turkish baths in Budapest. You got to see them, they're wonderful. But they're a symbol of Turkish domination of a Christian country. And all that stuff, when you say baked in, is what we're talking about. It's in the psyche of people.
Blood and belonging.
Yeah, and it's not in the psyche of Canadians. For Canadians, Islam is just another faith to be treated with respect, but not too much respect. I mean, you come in and, you know, we've had recent controversies about whether you can listen to music, and, you know, we've been pushing back and forward on that, as we should. It's, you know, it's, the majority in this country has a right to set and define the terms into which you integrate in this country. Same thing in Europe. But it's a more difficult struggle in Europe because the histories are different. The one thing I take away that has helped me with my small L liberalism is to give respect to the idea of different strokes for different folks. What works in Canada is not necessarily going to work in Poland, is not going to work in Hungary.
Okay, but how different do you want the strokes to be, though?
There's a limit, and that's human rights violation. And there's no question that the ways in which immigrants have been treated on that southern border in Hungary are violative of human rights. Nobody contests the right of a state like Hungary or Poland or any of these countries to define who comes in and who doesn't. But there has been a way in which Hungary has refused any act of generosity and hospitality. And I think that's been damaging to the country. And the point, if I can just, I'm going on a bit here, see, but there's one point I want to make here. I use the word generosity and hospitality. The most successful refugee program in the world politically, that is the one that had the best support around the world, has been the Canadian one. And it depends on private sponsorship by families. It depends on the generosity of Canadian families and a one-to-one relationship between a Canadian family or a Canadian community and refugees. And that tells you something really important. It tells you as a liberal that liberals tend to think of this, whether a refugee has a right of asylum in a country, as a matter of rights. The Canadian story tells me something subtly but importantly different. It's a relationship of a gift, not a right. Hospitality is a gift. Canadian families are saying, come on in. We want to make you a gift of the most important public good there is in the world, namely life in this country. Yeah. But we're going to decide who comes in, and if you come in, you're going to shape up with Canadian values and the Canadian program. And that's been tremendously successful. The language of the gift turns out to be much more successful politically than the language of the right. And that's a huge and complex message for liberals, because we don't like the language of the gift, because the gift is discretionary. I'll take you, Steve, but I'm not going to take that guy. The language of the gift has all kinds of moral problems with it, but it turns out to be the language that moved Canadians to make this gesture that the whole world has taken notice of.
I hear you, and I don't want to get you mired in domestic Canadian politics today, but the reality is that, the Conservative Party is having a leadership race right now, and one of the candidates, Kelly Leitch, is essentially running on, I think, something very similar to what you just said, which is we're going to screen you to make sure you embrace our Canadian values before we let you in. It sounded to me like you sort of said something like that just now.
I'm not going to be put in that box. I didn't mention screening. I was saying something very different. I think there are legitimate human rights limits on screening. People should be assessed on the basis of need, on the basis of their identity, proving who they say they are. That is no fraud, no deception. But screening them for values, all my liberal hackles actually go up, and I don't want to enter their leadership campaign, and I'm offshore now, and I don't want to go there. And I think I am saying something different. I'm saying that the thing that citizens insist upon in a liberal democracy is they have some say in who the gift is given to, right? And that the gift is a reciprocal relationship in which the person who accepts the gift accepts an obligation of some kind to live by Canadian norms. And 99.6% of the time, that's been the story of Canadian multiculturalism. And it's a my name is Ignatieff. How the heck did I get here? I got here because the gift worked. We were given the gift, and we've tried to repay it.
And that is the Agenda's Week in Review. You can see all of those programs in their entirety on our website, tvo.org, on our iTunes channel, and on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit tvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.